Tulog ta. Tulog ta, sleep ta, sleep, sleep. Sleep, 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 sleep. Sleep ta, sleep, sleep. Sleep ta. Dali. Dali mag-sleep ta.
Something happened that shook the very foundations of creation. God had sent special angels called... What if everything you thought you knew about the first woman was wrong? What if Eve wasn't actually the first? Sent special angels called the Watchers to guard and guide humanity. These heavenly beings had one simple job: watch over the children of men and protect them from harm. But the Watchers weren't satisfied with just watching. As they looked down at the growing human population, their hearts became twisted with desire. They saw something that caught their attention in ways it never should have: the daughters of men. But these weren't just any women. These were the daughters of Cain's bloodline, the descendants of the first murderer who killed his brother Abel. Cain's family had turned their backs on God generations earlier. Ancient books, like the Book of Adam and Eve, tell us that while Seth's children stayed on the mountains living holy lives, Cain's descendants chose a different path. They lived for pleasure, power, and wealth. They cared nothing for God's ways and everything for satisfying their earthly desires. These women from Cain's line weren't innocent victims waiting to be deceived. They were hungry for something more than ordinary life. They wanted power beyond human limits. They craved forbidden knowledge and secrets that only heavenly beings possessed. When the Watchers approached them, it wasn't a story of force or trickery. It was mutual rebellion. Both the fallen angels and these women wanted the same thing: to break God's rules and cross lines that should never be crossed. They didn't hesitate. The women welcomed the Watchers with open arms, became their wives, and together they brought something terrible into the world: the Nephilim. These weren't ordinary children. The Nephilim were giants, hybrid creatures with enormous strength who brought nothing but destruction wherever they went. They ruled with iron fists, crushed anyone who stood in their way, and spread chaos across the earth. Their hearts were as corrupt as their fathers, and their actions knew no limits. The world, already broken by sin, was now shattered even more. The blood flowing through the Nephilim's veins wasn't human blood. It was something far more corrupt. What was happening wasn't just any regular sin. It was a cosmic crime, a direct attack on God's perfect plan. Heaven watched everything with eyes of perfect justice. When the rebellion was complete, God's patience ran out. The heavenly court rose up, and judgment became unavoidable. Not only would the Watchers face punishment, but their wives would too. Those women who had knowingly joined the greatest rebellion ever recorded in Scripture. These women weren't just watching the angels fall. They were helping to push them down. They weren't victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were co-authors of the greatest act of defiance against God and His creation. They had joined with heavenly beings not for redemption, but for destruction. They embraced forbidden knowledge and power that didn't belong on earth. That's when Michael entered the picture. This great warrior angel of heaven had a dark and terrible mission. He wasn't just coming to lock up the Watchers. He was coming to deal with the women who had given birth to the Nephilim in a way that history, even with all its attempts to soften hard truths, would never dare to fully tell. What Michael was about to do wouldn't be merciful or kind. His actions would be devastating. The world, already hanging on the edge of disaster, would never be the same again. Before we can understand Michael's response, we need to grasp just how dangerous these women's children had become. The Nephilim weren't just big people. They were monsters, creatures of pure evil. The moment these women accepted the Watchers' offer, making their dark deal out of desire and corruption, it started a chain reaction that couldn't be stopped. At first, everything seemed like a dream come true for these women. Power, knowledge, and union with beings from another realm. These were deep desires they had carried, and they accepted them with joy. But they weren't helpless victims of cruel fate. They had seduced the angels, accepted the deal, and become part of a rebellion against the Creator. Ancient writings reveal that these women were already corrupt. They came from Cain's family line, whose descendants had long ago turned away from God. They didn't pray for holiness or cry out for forgiveness. Instead, they wanted the power the Watchers offered. They longed for the transformation that union with angels would bring. When they gave birth to the Nephilim, unspeakable evil spread across the earth. The Book of Enoch describes in horrifying detail what happened when these women had their children. They didn't give birth to normal babies, but to gigantic beings, monsters with unimaginable strength. The Nephilim consumed men without mercy. And when humanity had nothing left to offer, these giants turned on people themselves, eating them, destroying them, dragging them into endless darkness. But the destruction didn't stop there. The Nephilim taught humans secrets that should never have been revealed: magic spells, war strategies, and weapon making. Heaven had hidden this knowledge to protect humanity, but the Nephilim twisted and corrupted it, using it to spread terror everywhere. Human blood was spilled, innocence was destroyed, and God's creation was defiled. Most disturbing of all, the women, the mothers of these monsters, didn't feel sorry for what they had done. They didn't regret their choices. Instead, they celebrated the power they now had. They were the mothers of giants, the queens of an empire of destruction. They were the bloodline of kings and gods among men. Their children ruled with brutality, and they stood beside them, proud of their corruption, celebrating the terror their sons brought to humanity. But heaven was watching. Michael was watching. The commander of God's armies saw everything. He saw what the Nephilim had done, saw the suffering they caused, saw the growing pride of the women who had birthed these monsters. And he waited. He waited as these hybrid creatures taught dark arts. He waited as the giants crushed humanity under their feet. He waited as the mothers became more twisted, more defiant. God, in his endless mercy, gave them time, precious time to turn away from their evil, time to reject the power they had so freely accepted. But they didn't. They didn't turn away from corruption. Instead, they held on to it even tighter. Then God's patience came to an end. The measure of evil was full, and Michael received his orders. Go bind the Watchers, judge the women, clean the earth. Mercy was gone. What followed would no longer be compassion or forgiveness. It would be divine anger. And with Michael's anger, the earth would know destruction it could never have imagined. The women who had once held angelic lovers, who had touched heaven with their bodies, would soon face divine fire. Those arms that had held them in passion would now be the cause of their final fall. The mothers who had given birth to giants would now witness the birth of something much more terrifying: destruction, the final judgment that would cleanse the world of the evil they had brought into it. This was no longer just an act of rebellion. It was deep and permanent corruption that went beyond the physical body, invading the spirit and the very fabric of creation. God's creation itself was being defiled, and Michael, the fiercest and most fearless archangel of heaven's armies, was about to make sure that every trace of this betrayal was wiped from the face of the earth. The judgment began. The wives of the Watchers, who had once been worshipped and honored, now found themselves facing divine anger. Those who had once been respected as the mothers of giants, honored by both angelic and human beings, now saw the heavens open against them and destruction falling on their heads. The Book of Enoch tells us what happened next. God sent his holy ones, the most fearsome and powerful angels, and leading them was Michael, not as a messenger of mercy, not as a bearer of peace, but as the enforcer of heavenly justice. Go and announce to them, God said, that they will witness the destruction of their beloved. Bind them for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth. The judgment fell first on the Watchers, the angels who had rebelled and come down to earth to corrupt creation. They were bound, held by invisible chains, and thrown beneath deep mountains and empty deserts, where their light and glory would doomed fate forever. But the wives, the women who had given their bodies and souls to rebellion, weren't forgotten. According to ancient traditions and the Book of Enoch, Michael didn't just imprison them like he did the Watchers. Their punishment was even more terrible, more humiliating. Michael tore away from them what they treasured most, the beauty they had used to seduce the angels. That grace, that heavenly glow which had made them so desired, was taken from them, leaving only ugliness and deformity. Their faces, once radiant, now became pale and twisted. Their names, which had once been respected and feared by the giants, became cursed. Those who once honored them now rejected them. Ancient Jewish texts reveal something even darker. Some of these women, after the judgment, didn't find rest. They became cursed spirits, wandering the earth, tortured by their own guilt and deformed by God's anger. Others were simply erased from memory and existence, as if they had never lived, as if creation itself had forgotten them forever. But why such harshness? Why such extreme punishment? Because Michael knew what many still fail to understand. They weren't innocent. They weren't passive victims of fate. They had been co-creators of the rebellion, of the corruption that almost destroyed the earth. They had chosen the divine beings, the fallen angels, instead of choosing God's ways. They had surrendered to evil consciously, and when heaven gave them time to repent, they not only refused, but went deeper into their betrayal. Heaven's patience had run out. The corruption had already contaminated creation too deeply. The women who had once touched the heavens, who had the most powerful lovers the world has ever known, chose rebellion. And Michael, who always stands before God's throne, made sure that the price of betrayal would be paid in a final and unchangeable way. Heaven didn't forget. The earth wouldn't forget. And God's justice, carried out by Michael's tireless hand, would remain forever carved in the stones of history as a warning to all who dared challenge the divine order. Now the story takes a truly terrifying turn, something that challenges even human understanding. When we imagine punishment for such grand rebellion, we usually think of death, an immediate and final end. But for the wives of the Watchers, death wasn't enough. The punishment reserved for them was far deeper and crueler, something that stretched beyond physical death into the realms of eternity. In 1 Enoch chapter 19, verse 2, we face a disturbing revelation. And the women also of the angels who went astray shall become sirens. Sirens. But wait, sirens aren't angels. They aren't human. They are monsters. Cursed hybrids often shown in ancient stories as creatures, half woman, half beast, with a dark power of seduction. What the curse on these women represented wasn't only physical transformation into monstrous beings, but eternal condemnation, a punishment that extended throughout creation. In Greek stories, sirens were famous for their ability to lure sailors to their deaths with their hypnotic songs. They were the embodiment of deadly temptation, the song that led to destruction. But within Jewish traditions, sirens take on an even darker role. They were seen as unclean spirits, corrupted beings who lived in the seas and desolate places, creatures with an evil power of seduction and destruction. This is no mere coincidence. In biblical thought, especially during the Second Temple period, the sea symbolized chaos, divine judgment, and separation from God's presence. The sea was a place of darkness and destruction, a realm where humans shouldn't venture without facing consequences. When these women were transformed into sirens, it wasn't just a change in physical form. They were cast out of God's presence, condemned to wander in the darkness of chaos as shadows of what they had once been. These women who had once surrendered to fallen angels and tasted forbidden pleasures were now cast into monstrous forms, rejected by both heaven and earth. They no longer belonged to the human or heavenly realm. This wasn't mercy. It was a living curse, a transformation that made them the very embodiment of corruption. Now their mission ambition, which had once been disguised as desire, temptation, and seduction, became eternal. They had been the secret seductresses, those who silently corrupted humanity. Now they were condemned to continue their role as temptresses, but in a distorted and cruel way. They became monstrous beings with the sole purpose of luring men to destruction. What they had once done in the shadows would now be their eternal fate, leading humanity to corruption, sin, and downfall. But their curse didn't stop there. You might ask, was being transformed into sirens the only punishment? The answer, with the weight of 1,000 storms, is no. Ancient scriptures and hidden sources suggest deep layers of judgment upon these women. The Apocalypse of Peter, an early Christian text, describes a terrifying vision of hell where women who seduced men to sin are hung by their hair over a boiling sea. Those who had once attracted others to corruption are now bound, exposed to eternal torment and shame. These images aren't mere fantasies. Many ancient interpreters, both Jewish and Christian, believed that these descriptions didn't refer only to the souls of common sinners, but also to the wives of the Watchers. These women, who were the co-creators of heavenly rebellion, were now subjected to eternal torment, their souls in constant suffering, their actions corrupting them further each moment. According to the Book of Jubilees, after the flood, Noah, the righteous man, begged God for humanity, fearing that the evil spirits, descendants of the Nephilim and the wives of the Watchers, would continue to corrupt his descendants. God, in his justice, allowed only a portion of these spirits to remain to test humanity, but sealed the rest, binding them beneath the earth in deep chains. While the passage mainly refers to the spirits of the Nephilim, many ancient teachers believe that the wives of the Watchers shared this fate. They were imprisoned, sealed in the depths, not destroyed, for destruction, in its mercy, would have been a relief. Their punishment was an eternal existence in disgrace. They wouldn't vanish, but live in living shame, tormented by their own corruption and separation from divine favor. Once honored among women, they were now hated. Once united to fallen angels, they were now divorced from both heaven and earth. Once mothers of powerful warriors, they were now mothers of monsters whose existences would be cursed forever. These women, once exalted, now became the very incarnation of the curse, with their souls twisted and lost forever. And ultimately, their greatest punishment was silence. The post-flood sacred texts are utterly silent about them. Their names vanished. There were no more family records, no more stories. They were erased from collective memory, excluded from the book of life. For biblical thought, this was the greatest form of divine rejection possible, to be completely erased, forgotten. Yes, the sirens were undoubtedly part of their curse. They became living symbols of corruption, abandonment, and divine judgment, condemned to wander endlessly in the depths of the sea, seeking souls to seduce but never finding relief. The story they began of power and seduction ended with silence and forgetfulness, a punishment that would never cease. The punishment of the wives of the Watchers wasn't merely physical destruction or death, but something far deeper, something that strikes at the darkest layers of human and spiritual existence. Their true punishment wasn't simply an end, but eternal exile, a disgrace that consumed them forever. They wouldn't be destroyed, for destruction would, in some sense, be mercy. What happened to them was eternal torment, divine banishment in its purest form. But why such severity? Why was Michael's punishment and heavenly justice so relentless? The reason lay not in personal revenge, but in something deeper, the preservation of God's creation itself. The balance that had been broken by the rebellion wasn't just an offense to heaven. It was a corruption of the very fabric of creation. The wives of the Watchers didn't merely sin, they voluntarily broke the natural order, defying divine will by uniting with fallen angels. They seduced the divine, became accomplices to the corruption that invaded the earth, and gave birth to a race of monsters whose legacy of violence, sorcery, and war spread like cancer. They became the fertile ground for everything God hates: violence, pride, mockery, destruction of God's image in humanity. This wasn't an evil that could be ignored. The corruption they helped create was something that, if left unchecked, would destroy all of creation. For Michael, the heavenly prince, the one who stands at God's right hand, the great enforcer of divine decrees, mercy had already run out. Justice was no longer an option. It was a necessity. The divine command was given: destroy the descendants of the Watchers among men and send them against each other so that they destroy themselves in battle. Also bind the wives so they no longer seduce humanity. This decree is implied in Enoch and expanded upon in Jewish oral traditions. Michael wasn't just the bearer of the heavenly sword. He led this terrible judgment. He oversaw the extermination of the Nephilim, the civil war among the giants, the plagues and famine that decimated those who had corrupted the earth. He also ensured the sealing of evil spirits so they could no longer walk freely among men. But for the wives, the judgment was even more poetic, a sentence that deeply reflected the crimes they had committed. These women, who had seduced with beauty and temptation, became deformed beings. What they had used to attract fallen angels was now the cause of their transformation into sirens. They were no longer beautiful, but monstrous, no longer desired, but rejected, cursed to attract, seduce, and deceive, but never to find satisfaction, honor, or power again. Their punishment was the curse of eternal contempt and constant torment. Michael, as the enforcer of justice, ensured that each of their crimes was paid for justly, and with that, their story came to an end. There was no mercy, no redemption. There was only eternal silence. But you might ask, why does this matter now? This happened thousands of years ago. What does it have to do with us? The answer, although uncomfortable, is clear. Everything. Jesus gave us a terrifying prophecy that in many ways seems to be ignored in today's world. He said, as it was in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. But let's think more deeply about those words. He wasn't just talking about wickedness or moral corruption. It wasn't just a warning against sin. Jesus was suggesting something much deeper, something dark and disturbing. In the days of Noah, the line between the divine and the human was broken.
Have you ever wondered how humanity managed to grow if Adam and Eve only had sons? The Bible tells us Adam and Eve had 3 sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth. So where did Cain's wife come from? And what about Seth's wife? And there's something even more puzzling. Genesis claims that Adam had sons and daughters, but never mentions a single daughter by name. Were there other humans outside Eden? And if those daughters truly existed, why have their stories been erased? Join us as we explore this mystery, an untold chapter from humanity's earliest days. When Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, they didn't just lose their home, they lost their closeness to God and the innocence of those first days. They walked eastward into a harsh, rough, and unknown land. There they began their new life as survivors, and in the midst of that exile, their first children were born. Genesis chapter 5 reveals, this is the written account of Adam's family line. After he fathered Seth, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Adam and Eve had sons and daughters. The book of Genesis is clear about this, and it makes sense, because without women, humanity could not have continued. Yet why does the Bible only tell us the story of their sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth? In Genesis, we read that the first to arrive was Cain, the first man born outside of Eden. From childhood, he felt the burden of being the firstborn, the one who had to pave the way. Soon after Cain came Abel. Brothers, Cain and Abel grew up together, yet from the very start, they couldn't have been more different. Cain became a farmer, a man of the earth who relied on hard labor, his hands roughened from working the hoe. Abel, on the other hand, was a shepherd, spending his days among his sheep, feeling the breeze and gazing skyward. There was a quiet peace in his eyes that Cain never understood. and soon came to resent. One day each brought an offering to God. Cain presented fruits from his harvest, but Abel chose the firstborn lambs from his flock, their richest portions, the very best he had. God looked favorably upon Abel's offering, yet he rejected Cain's. Something inside Cain broke in that moment. The rejection wounded him deeply, and pride pushed him closer to darkness. Seeing clearly what stirred in Cain's heart, God spoke directly to him. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It was both a warning and an open door to repentance, but Cain refused to cross it, silently making a decision of his own. The next day, Cain approached Abel and said, "Let's go out to the field." Abel didn't hesitate, walking alongside his brother as he had always done. Then suddenly, out in the field, Cain attacked Abel. He grabbed a stone from the ground and struck Abel hard on the head. Abel collapsed, dying, a look of trust still in his eyes. His blood soaked deeply into the earth, and for the first time ever, death entered the world, not brought on by sickness or accident, but by hatred and envy. Then the voice of God thundered powerfully in Cain's mind, "Where is your brother Abel?" But Cain, heart hardened, replied coldly, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" It was the most painful of lies, not just because he denied the crime, but because he rejected responsibility for what he had done. Then God proclaimed his judgment. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth. Cursed are you from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." At that very moment, Cain's life changed forever, and the ground he once farmed turned barren. But the strangest moment came when Cain raised his voice and cried out, "Today you drive me from the land, and whoever finds me will kill me." Whoever? Who else could find him when, according to the story, only his parents, Adam and Eve, and now himself, were alive? Who was Cain afraid of? That one phrase hides a profound mystery. Either Cain knew there were others in the world, or God had revealed to him there would be more people. In any case, his fear was real, yet God chose not to allow his death and instead marked him. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. We are never told what this mark actually was. We don't know if it was visible, spiritual, symbolic, or physical. All we know is it was enough to make anyone afraid to harm him. Thus Cain left. He literally went out from the presence of the Lord, and his life story would no longer unfold beneath God's direct gaze. He went east of Eden to a land called Nod, whose name means wandering. But there, in that place marked by exile, something surprising happened. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. Yet this raises another mystery. How did Cain find a wife if, up until that point, only Adam, Eve, and their 3 sons had been mentioned? There are 3 hypotheses attempting to answer this question. The first, and most widely accepted within biblical tradition, is that Cain married his own sister. Although this possibility might seem troubling by today's standards, it is strongly supported by biblical context. In a newly created world where all humanity descended from a single couple, marriages between siblings or close relatives would have been unavoidable. At the time, incest wasn't considered sinful, simply because there were no laws established yet to forbid it. Humanity was still being shaped, and societal norms and regulations did not yet exist. It's also important to note that people lived extraordinarily long lives back then. Adam reached the age of 930, allowing multiple generations to coexist simultaneously. There could have been dozens of sons and daughters born over the centuries. Cain, therefore, could have married a younger sister or even a niece. It was natural, the only way to populate the earth, and this practice wasn't exclusive to Cain. Even the Bible itself shows that the patriarchs among God's people married close relatives. Abraham married Sarah, his half-sister. Isaac, his son, married Rebekah, his cousin's daughter. And Jacob Jacob, Abraham's grandson, married Leah and Rachel, daughters of his uncle Laban. All these unions took place within their own family, and without them, the story of Israel's people would never have begun. Thus, everything points to Cain's wife being a sister born to Adam and Eve. But if Cain's wife truly was his sister, why doesn't the Bible explicitly mention this? Why does a text that carefully names entire genealogies, detailing ages, family lines, and descendants, stay silent at precisely this point? And here arises the second hypothesis, one far more controversial. What if God created other human beings besides Adam and Eve? The idea may seem radical because it doesn't explicitly appear in the Bible, but it comes from reasoning meant to fill gaps within the story. After Abel's murder, when God condemned Cain to wander the earth, Cain responded with fear that someone would kill him. Later we learn that Cain not only took a wife, but also had a son and built a city. But nobody builds a city just for 3 people. You need a community, laborers, families, entire generations. Where did they all come from? These questions have led some people to propose that perhaps the story of Adam and Eve isn't the only human story, but instead the primary one, that God, in addition to creating humanity in Eden, might have created other groups of humans elsewhere in the world as part of a broader plan. In Genesis chapter 1 we read, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them." Due to this verse, some believe the Eden narrative is a specific account centered around one chosen couple, while other humans could have existed simultaneously. Under this hypothesis, Cain's wife would not have been his sister, but instead a woman descended from a separate human lineage not mentioned in Scripture, existing outside of Eden, and the city Cain built would have been populated by these other groups. But this theory directly conflicts with the fundamental teaching of the Christian faith, the unity of all humanity. Because according to the Bible, every person descends from one man. The Apostle Paul clearly affirmed this when he said, "From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth." This is not simply a minor detail. It forms the very foundation of the gospel message. If all of us descend from Adam's bloodline, then we all share his fallen nature, and we all have access to redemption. But if there were 2 separate lineages, if there were people who didn't descend from Adam, then there would also be those who didn't inherit his sinfulness, and therefore wouldn't need a Messiah. This would open a fracture that runs through the entire Bible, starting from Genesis and reaching all the way to the cross. For this reason, many believers feel this theory undermines the core of God's plan for salvation, and most Christian traditions firmly reject it. So far, we've examined 2 possibilities. Either Cain's wife was a sister, born to Adam and Eve, as the Bible seems to suggest, or she belonged to an unknown, alternative human lineage, as proposed by some other interpretations. But there's a third possibility, one that doesn't come from the canonical text, but rather from an ancient book preserved along the margins of biblical history, a book that might hold the key. We're talking about the Book of Jubilees, written in the 2nd century BC. This work isn't a hidden book. It's simply one that was left out of the Bible, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis. It rearranges the early biblical stories and fills them with details not found in the traditional text. Indeed, the Book of Jubilees explicitly states that Adam and Eve had daughters, even naming them. Specifically, it mentions a woman named Awan as Cain's wife. Yes, according to this ancient source, Cain married his own sister Awan, daughter of Adam and Eve, and Awan isn't the only daughter mentioned. The text also introduces Azura, another daughter of Adam and Eve, who was given as a wife to Seth, the third named son we find in Genesis. Thus, an early family structure emerges: Cain and Awan, Seth and Azura. Moreover, the Book of Jubilees reveals the precise timing when all these events occurred. According to this ancient text, each birth was carefully recorded in a divine calendar, a calendar measured not in years as we know them, but in jubilees. Each jubilee spans 49 years, and within this sacred cycle, humanity's earliest steps were recorded. Nothing unfolded by chance. Cain was born in the first year of the third jubilee, exactly 130 years after creation began. He was the very first person born outside paradise, the first never to know Eden. 2 years later, in the third year of that same jubilee, Abel was born. And after the years of mourning for Abel's death had passed, Seth was born. In the first year of the fourth jubilee, our year 190, Seth came as a promise, as the renewal of something precious that had been lost. Yet the book also specifically mentions the births of the daughters. Awan, Cain's wife, was born in the seventh year of the third jubilee. This means she was 6 years younger than her brother. Awan was the first daughter of Adam and Eve to be named, and according to the book of Jubilees, she was given as wife to her brother Cain. In ancient Hebrew, Awan's name has meanings connected with sorrow, sin, and vanity, although other interpretations associate her name with desire, longing, or even strength. This dual meaning is no coincidence. Cain took Awan as his wife when he was 40 years old. He knew her, the text tells us, in the land of Nod. And there, upon that strange and cursed soil, they conceived Enoch and built a city bearing his name. Thus, Awan represents the woman who carried life onward from exile through the cursed lineage emerging after Abel's murder. Yet Azura, the second daughter of Adam and Eve, has a deeply meaningful story. According to the book of Jubilees, Azura was born in the third year of the fifth jubilee, year 197 after creation. Since Abel died before year 190, the two could not possibly have met in person, as Azura was born after Abel's death. Nonetheless, the book of Jubilees reveals something intriguing. And Adam and his wife mourned Abel for 4 weeks of years, and then in the fourth jubilee they conceived Seth, and they gave Seth the hand of his sister Azura, who had been previously promised to Abel before his death. Scholars interpret this passage symbolically, suggesting Azura was meant for Abel even before her birth, meaning their union had been planned by Adam and Eve for when they grew older, but Abel's tragic murder prevented it. Therefore, Azura was first betrothed to Abel, and after his death, given instead to Seth. From their union came Enos, and with him, humanity's spiritual awakening. Thus, Azura was destined from the very beginning to belong to the righteous lineage, and her marriage to Seth signified a new start in God's divine plan for humankind. Her name, Azura, is connected to the blue of the sky and to lapis lazuli, a precious gemstone that ancient cultures associated with purity, truth, and closeness to the divine. In Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, lapis lazuli adorned crowns, temples, and sacred objects. They called it the stone of heaven, and that is exactly what Azura symbolizes in this story, humanity's return to God. From the union of Seth and Azura came Enosh, and with him, something entirely new awakened within humanity's heart. Until that time, people had not actively sought after God, but with Enosh, everything changed. Genesis sums it up in a brief yet immensely powerful phrase. People began to call on the name of the Lord. For the first time, human beings recognized that they needed something more than mere land, food, or descendants. They needed their Creator. It was with Enosh that worship was born. Humans understood that they couldn't walk alone. They needed the God who had formed them. And thus, for the first time, prayers emerged, songs arose, and words were lifted, not toward humanity, but toward heaven itself. Enosh may not be as well known as Adam, Cain, or Noah, but it was beneath his guidance that humanity began to pray, to gather together, and to remember that God was still present. But these two families represent two contrasting paths, two branches of the same tree, one marked by exile, the other by the promise of redemption. From Enosh arose a distinct lineage, quiet yet powerful. From him would come Kenan, then Mahalalel, then Jared, and from Jared would be born Enoch. said centuries later, Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. A man who walked so closely with the Creator that he never experienced death, but was taken up into heaven. But even before Enoch, the path was already carefully laid. Each child learned not only how to cultivate the land or raise animals, but also to keep the commandments of God, even before they were etched in stone at Sinai. Because yes, even though the law had not yet been given to Moses, the book of Jubilees affirms that from the beginning, Adam passed down to his children the eternal ordinances of heaven, the festivals of the Lord, the Sabbath day, laws of purity, justice, and the fear of God. It was not empty religion. It was a living covenant, handed down from father to son, generation after generation. While Cain's descendants built cities, forged weapons, and invented musical instruments, the line of Seth crafted something far deeper, a living memory devoted to the Most High. In that ancient world, people lived for centuries, seeing not only their children grow up, but their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren. Adam lived for 930 years. Methuselah, the oldest of them all, lived to 969, and through all those long centuries, the righteous passed on the story of Eden, the fall, and the promise of a return. They told it at nightfall. They repeated it at dawn. Thus, although sin spread rapidly, there remained a family who remembered God. They were few, but faithful. They lived surrounded by a humanity drifting away, choosing instead the path of power, dominance, and violence. And so, the line continued. Jared fathered Enoch, Enoch fathered Methuselah, Methuselah fathered Lamech, and from Lamech would come Noah. But during these years, something happened. The sons of God, those descended from Seth, began to take as wives the daughters of men. It was an alliance that never should have happened. Seth's descendants began to stray, captivated by the beauty of women from Cain's line, women raised in a culture of power, sensuality, and pride, and they took them as wives. Genesis is clear. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. It was the merging of two worlds, the world of the covenant and the world of oblivion, and from this union were born giants, the Nephilim, men of great stature and violence, who filled the earth with their strength and their cruelty. The Hebrew word Nephilim stems from a root meaning the fallen ones. They were violent men, infamous for their brutality, who imposed their dominance over others. They were revered as demigods, but they were monsters. Genesis confirms this. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. And we also read in the book of Jubilees, and it came to pass, when the children of men began multiplying upon the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the angels of God saw them in a certain year of that Jubilee, how beautiful they were to behold, and they took wives for themselves from among all whom they chose.
see. Medyo ka, mother. Stop there.